It was a cold morning in a sleepy little town nestled in the foothills. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the streets were bathed in a faint golden hue. Inside the rising dough, a quaint bakery renowned for its mouth-watering pastries, an unassuming man named Jack Hunter worked tirelessly. Flour dusted his broad shoulders, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms marked by faint scars. To anyone passing by, Jack was just another baker, a man who preferred the quiet life, dedicated to his craft. What no one knew was that Jack was more than just a baker. He was a former Navy SEAL, a man who had seen the darkest corners of the world and survived them. After years of high-stakes missions and unimaginable pressure, he'd chosen to trade his rifle for a rolling pin, seeking peace in the simplest of pleasures: baking. But that peace was about to be shattered. The tranquility of the morning was interrupted by the guttural roar of motorcycle engines. A group of 5 bikers thundered into town, their leather jackets adorned with insignias that hinted at a life of lawlessness. They were loud, obnoxious, and looking for trouble. The leader, a towering man with a jagged scar across his cheek named Blade, parked his bike in front of the rising dough and smirked at his crew. "Looks like we've got ourselves a nice little spot for breakfast," Blade said, his voice dripping with menace. As the bikers entered the bakery, their presence was impossible to ignore. The air grew tense, and the few early morning customers hurried out, not wanting to get caught in whatever was about to unfold. Jack, however, remained calm, his sharp eyes assessing the situation while he continued kneading dough. Blade leaned on the counter, sneering. "Hey, chef, why don't you whip up something special for us? And make it quick. We don't like to wait." Jack wiped his hands on his apron and looked up, his expression calm but firm. Sure thing. Menus on the wall. Pick what you want, and I'll get started." The bikers laughed mockingly, their voices echoing in the small bakery. "You don't get it, do you?" Blade growled. "We're not paying." For a moment there was silence. Jack's hands froze mid-motion, his eyes locking onto Blade's. It was the kind of look that made even the toughest of men hesitate, a silent warning born from years of training and discipline. But the bikers didn't back down. Blade leaned in closer, his grin widening. "What's the matter, chef? Scared? If you think this is going to end well for the bikers, think again. Before we dive into what happens next, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming." The tension in the rising dough was palpable. The air felt heavy, and Jack's steady gaze never wavered from Blade. The other bikers, emboldened by their leader, began causing havoc in the bakery. One of them knocked over a display of freshly baked croissants, laughing as the golden pastries scattered across the floor. Another opened the glass case and started grabbing muffins, taking greedy bites before tossing them aside like trash. "Guess these are on the house, right?" one of them sneered, crumbs falling from his mouth. Jack didn't react. His years of training had taught him patience, a skill that had saved his life countless times. But inside, a storm was brewing. He hated bullies, and these men embodied everything he had sworn to protect others from. Blade, still leaning on the counter, grew impatient. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" "I don't like quiet. Makes me nervous." "How about you say something, chef?" Jack calmly set down his dough and removed his apron, folding it neatly and placing it on the counter. He stepped out from behind the counter, his towering frame now fully visible. Despite his age, his physique was intimidating. Broad shoulders, a strong stance, and a presence that demanded respect. "You've had your fun," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. "Now it's time to leave." Blade chuckled darkly, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he assumed was just a simple baker. "Or what?" Blade said, his tone mocking. "You gonna call the cops?" The other bikers laughed, their voices harsh and grating. One of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling up his neck, stepped closer to Jack. "Listen, old man, maybe you don't get how this works. We take what we want and you stay out of our way. Got it?" Jack didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the man, and for a moment, it felt like the temperature in the room dropped. "I'm going to ask you one last time," Jack said, his voice low but commanding. "Leave now." But the bikers weren't done. Blade smirked and grabbed a tray of donuts from the counter, throwing it to the ground with a loud crash. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Looks like we made a mess. Better clean that up, chef." Jack's jaw tightened, but he still didn't react. It was Snake, emboldened by Jack's lack of response, who finally crossed the line. He reached out, shoving Jack hard in the chest. "Do something, tough guy," Snake taunted. That was the moment Jack decided enough was enough. Jack didn't move at first. He just stood there, his piercing eyes fixed on Snake. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of years of experience and unshakable confidence, he said, "You really don't want to do this?" Snake laughed nervously, glancing back at his crew for support. "Yeah? And why's that?" Jack took a slow step forward, his presence alone making Snake take a step back. "Because you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The bakery was silent now, the bikers momentarily stunned by Jack's shift in demeanor. Blade narrowed his eyes, sensing that something wasn't quite right about this simple baker. "All right, old man," Blade growled, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see what you've got." The bakery seemed frozen in time. The customers who had fled earlier were now peering through the windows from a safe distance, their faces a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. Inside, the bikers were grinning like wolves, their laughter breaking the eerie silence. Blade, still smirking, nodded at Snake. "Go ahead. Teach this guy a lesson." Snake, emboldened by his leader's command, stepped forward and threw a lazy punch at Jack's chest. It was a mistake, a big one. Jack moved with lightning speed, his body a blur. Before Snake even realized what was happening, Jack caught his wrist mid-air, twisting it with precision. The sound of bones cracking echoed through the bakery as Snake cried out in pain, dropping to his knees. The other bikers froze, their grins faltering. This wasn't the reaction they had expected from a baker. "Let him go," Blade barked, his voice sharp. Jack released Snake, who cradled his wrist and stumbled back to the group. Jack's eyes were calm, his breathing steady. He hadn't broken a sweat. "Last warning," Jack said, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "Get out, now." But Blade wasn't the type to back down, especially not in front of his crew. He couldn't afford to look weak. "You think you're tough, huh?" Blade sneered. "You think you're tough, huh?" Blade sneered. "We're gonna show you what tough looks like." With a wave of his hand, Blade signaled the other bikers to join in. 4 of them rushed Jack at once, fists raised, their movements clumsy but aggressive. What followed was a masterclass in combat. Jack sidestepped the first attacker with ease, using the man's momentum against him. A well-placed palm strike to the chest sent the biker crashing into a table, knocking it over. The second biker lunged at Jack, but Jack ducked low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The biker hit the ground hard, gasping for air. The third and fourth bikers hesitated for a split second, but it was long enough for Jack to close the gap. He delivered a sharp elbow strike to one's jaw, dropping him instantly, before spinning around and delivering a precise kick to the other's stomach, sending him sprawling into the display case. The entire confrontation lasted less than 20 seconds. Blade's smirk was gone, replaced by a scowl. He looked at his crew, now groaning on the floor, and then back at Jack. Something about the way Jack stood, his posture, his calm demeanor, set off alarm bells in Blade's mind. "You're not just some baker," Blade said, his voice laced with suspicion. Jack didn't respond. He simply stared at Blade, his silence more intimidating than any words could have been. "You've got skills," Blade continued, stepping closer but keeping his distance. "Military, maybe? Special forces?" Jack remained silent, his expression unreadable. Blade's frustration boiled over. He wasn't used to being ignored, and he wasn't about to let this baker make a fool out of him. He pulled out a knife, the blade glinting under the fluorescent lights of the bakery. "You think you're tough?" Blade growled, pointing the knife at Jack. "Let's see how tough you are now." The sight of the weapon didn't faze Jack. If anything, it made him more focused. His eyes locked onto Blade's, analyzing every movement, every twitch of his muscles. "You really don't want to do this," Jack said calmly, his voice steady. But Blade didn't listen. He lunged forward, aiming the knife at Jack's chest. Time seemed to slow as Jack moved. With the precision of a seasoned warrior, He sidestepped the attack and grabbed Blade's wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. In one fluid motion, Jack delivered a controlled strike to Blade's arm, disarming him completely. Before Blade could recover, Jack grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. The force was enough to knock the wind out of Blade, leaving him gasping for air. Jack leaned in close, his voice a low growl. "I don't care who you are, or what you've done. You don't come into my bakery and threaten me or anyone else. Do I make myself clear?" Blade nodded weakly. The fight completely drained out of him. Jack released Blade, who slumped to the floor, clutching his ribs. The other bikers were still groaning, too battered to even stand. Jack picked up the knife and tossed it behind the counter, out of reach. "Take your crew and get out," Jack said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And don't come back." The bikers scrambled to their feet, helping each other out the door. Blade was the last to leave, his pride shattered. He glanced back at Jack one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred, before disappearing into the morning light. Just when Jack thought it was over, the faint sound of motorcycle engines roared to life again. The bikers weren't leaving town. They were regrouping. Blade wasn't the type to let a humiliation like this go unanswered. Jack watched them through the window, his mind already running through the possibilities. He knew this wasn't over. Blade and his crew didn't go far. They regrouped in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town, their pride bruised and their anger boiling over. Blade paced back and forth, nursing his ribs while the others leaned against their bikes, some holding ice packs to their swollen faces. Snake, still clutching his broken wrist, spat out, "Who the hell is this guy, Blade?" "No regular baker moves like that." Blade's jaw tightened. "He's more than just a baker. That much is obvious." He kicked a discarded beer can across the lot, frustration evident in his every move. But he made one big mistake. The crew looked at him, waiting for an explanation. "He underestimated us," Blade continued, his voice low and dangerous. "We're not walking away from this. Not after what he did to us." One of the younger bikers, Jax, hesitated before speaking. "Are you sure about this, Blade?" "That guy, he's trained. Maybe we should just let it go." Blade whipped around, his glare silencing Jax instantly. "Let it go? Do you want everyone in town to think we're weak? To think that some old man running a bakery can walk all over us?" The crew grumbled in agreement. Their reputation was at stake, and Blade knew exactly how to manipulate their bruised egos. "We're going back tonight," Blade declared, his tone final. "This time, we're not just roughing him up. We're going to send a message." Back at the bakery, Jack locked the front door and flipped the sign to "Close." The once bustling shop was eerily quiet, the faint smell of baked goods lingering in the air. Jack walked to the back room, where shelves of flour and sugar lined the walls. But his destination wasn't the pantry. He reached for a hidden latch beneath one of the shelves and pulled, revealing a concealed compartment. Inside were items that didn't belong in a bakery: a combat knife, a small handgun, and a few other tools from his past life. Jack sat down at a small table, his hands steady as he checked the weapon. He hadn't touched it in years, not since leaving the Navy SEALs. He had promised himself he was done with violence, done with the chaos that came with it, but the events of the day had made it clear. Some things couldn't be avoided. As he prepared, Jack's mind drifted back to his days in the SEALs, the missions, the camaraderie, the high-stakes operations that had pushed him to his limits. He remembered the lives he had saved and the lives he had taken. Those memories weren't easy to live with, but they had shaped him into who he was. And, while he had hoped to leave that part of his life behind, he knew he still had the skills to handle whatever came his way. Nightfall blanketed the town, the streets quiet except for the occasional car passing by. Jack stood by the bakery's window watching the road. He wasn't surprised when he saw the headlights in the distance, followed by the rumble of motorcycle engines. The bikers arrived in force this time. Blade had called in reinforcements, and now there were nearly a dozen of them, their bikes lined up in front of the bakery like a fleet of war horses. Jack stepped away from the window, his expression unreadable. He wasn't scared, far from it, but he knew this wasn't going to end without a fight. Blade dismounted his bike and barked orders to his crew. We're going in hard and fast, trash the place, and if he fights back. Blade pulled out a crowbar, his lips curling into a sinister grin. We'll make sure he regrets it. Unbeknownst to the bikers, Jack had spent the hours before their arrival preparing. He wasn't going to face them head-on. Not yet. Instead, he had turned the bakery into a tactical battlefield. The lights inside were dimmed, the counters rearranged to create choke points. Flour bags were strategically placed, ready to be slashed open to create clouds of dust that would obscure visibility. The floor near the entrance was slick with a thin layer of oil, invisible to the untrained eye. Jack positioned himself near the back, his movements silent and deliberate. He wasn't just defending his bakery, he was defending his sanctuary, the life he had built after years of hardship. Blade and his crew kicked down the door, their boots echoing on the tile floor. The smell of baked goods was still in the air, an ironic contrast to the violence they were about to unleash. "Where are you, old man?" Blade shouted, his voice dripping with malice. "Come out and face us!" The bikers spread out, smashing display cases and overturning tables. One of them stepped on the oil-slicked floor and immediately lost his footing, crashing into a counter with a loud thud. "Watch your step, idiot!" Another biker growled, but the warning came too late. Two more bikers slipped, their curses filling the air as they scrambled to regain their footing. And then, the lights went out. Panic set in as the bikers found themselves plunged into darkness. Jack moved like a shadow, his Navy SEAL training coming to the forefront. He used the confusion to his advantage, taking down one biker at a time. A swift strike to the back of the knee sent one man collapsing to the ground. Another found himself caught in a chokehold, his struggles futile as Jack incapacitated him. The bikers swung blindly, their voices filled with fear. "What the hell is going on?" one of them shouted. Blade lit a flashlight, his face pale as he tried to make sense of the chaos. But the beam of light only made him a target. Jack appeared out of nowhere, disarming Blade with a single motion and sending the flashlight skittering across the floor. "This is your last chance," Jack said, his voice cold and commanding. "Leave, now." Cliffhanger set up as the bikers retreated, dragging their wounded comrades with them. Blade made a chilling promise. "This isn't over," he hissed, his eyes filled with rage. "You'll pay for this, old man." Jack watched them go, his mind already preparing for what was to come. He knew Blade wasn't bluffing, and that the next round would be even more dangerous. As the bikers sped off into the night, their engines echoing through the quiet town, Jack took a deep breath. The smell of flour and smashed glass filled the air. His bakery, his sanctuary, now bore the scars of the evening's battle. The display cases were shattered, tables overturned, and the once pristine floors were a mess of oil, debris, and blood from minor scuffles. Jack picked up a chair, setting it upright near the counter. He sat down, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Though he had triumphed tonight, he knew the storm was far from over. Blade and his gang would be back. And next time, they'd come with more firepower and greater resolve. Jack's hand unconsciously drifted to the scars on his forearm, reminders of a past life spent in war zones and hostile territories, memories of missions where he had to outsmart enemies, protect teammates, and survive against impossible odds played like a reel in his mind. He had sworn to leave that life behind, but tonight had proven that some battles couldn't be avoided. Jack rose from the chair, his resolve hardening. He walked to the back of the bakery where his secret arsenal was stashed. Carefully, he began unpacking the tools he thought he'd never need again. Among them was his old tactical vest, its patches still bearing the marks of years spent in combat, and a meticulously maintained sniper rifle he had kept for emergencies. He inspected each item with the precision of a man who had spent decades perfecting his craft. Knives were sharpened, ammunition was counted, and improvised traps were sketched out on a notepad. Jack wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was preparing for a war. He took a moment to step outside, looking up at the stars. The bakery's back lot was quiet, the cool night air brushing against his face. Jack's mind was calm, focused. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. He wasn't going to let a gang of thugs take away the peace he had worked so hard to build. Meanwhile, in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Blade and his crew regrouped. The mood was electric with anger and wounded pride. Several bikers sat nursing their injuries, while others worked on their bikes, tuning them for the next encounter. Blade stood at the center of the room, a map of the town spread out on a table before him. He slammed his fist down, silencing the murmurs of the group. "Enough!" he barked, his voice echoing in the dimly lit space. "That old man made fools of us tonight, but we're not going to let him get away with it." Snake, still favoring his broken wrist, stepped forward. "Blade, that guy isn't normal. He's trained? Military, maybe even special forces. We can't just walk in there like last time." Blade's eyes narrowed. "Then we don't walk in, we hit him where it hurts. He wants to play soldier. Fine. Let's see how he handles an ambush." The bikers leaned in as Blade outlined his plan. This time, they wouldn't just confront Jack at the bakery. They would lure him out, isolate him, and ensure there was no escape. Their strategy was ruthless, designed to exploit Jack's humanity and tactical mind. "We'll start with his truck," Blade said, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "Slash the tires, smash the windows. He can't go anywhere without wheels. Then we'll light up his bakery, make him come to us." A younger biker hesitated. "Burn the bakery. Isn't that a bit much, Blade?" Blade's expression darkened. "This isn't just about the bakery. It's about sending a message. No one messes with us and gets away with it. Got it?" The room fell silent, the bikers exchanging uneasy glances. But Blade's authority was absolute, and none dared challenge him. Back at the bakery, Jack was already anticipating their next move. He spent the early hours of the morning reinforcing the building, turning it into a fortress. The front windows were boarded up, and the doors were reinforced with metal bars. Jack also installed a series of surveillance cameras, their feeds displayed on an old laptop in the back room. He watched the live footage intently, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The town was quiet, but Jack's instincts told him the bikers wouldn't wait long to strike. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. As dawn broke, Jack was startled by a knock at the back door. He moved cautiously, his hand resting on the handgun tucked into his waistband. Peering through the peephole, he saw two familiar faces. Sam, the young boy he had defended earlier, and his mother, Clara. Jack opened the door, his expression softening as he saw the worry etched on Clara's face. "Jack," Clara began, her voice trembling, "I heard what happened last night. Are you okay?" Jack nodded. "I'm fine, but you two shouldn't be here." "It's not safe." Clara hesitated, glancing down at Sam, who clutched a small paper bag. "We just wanted to thank you for what you did. Sam insisted on bringing you something." Sam stepped forward, holding out the bag. "It's cookies. Mom helped me bake them," he said shyly. Jack smiled, taking the bag. "Thank you, Sam. That means a lot." Clara's expression grew serious. "Jack, I know you can handle yourself, but these men, they're dangerous. The whole town's talking about it. Maybe you should leave for a while, let things cool down." Jack shook his head. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not running. This is my home, and I'm not letting them take it from me." Clara placed a hand on his arm, her eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. "Just be careful, Jack. The town needs you. Sam and I need you." As they left, Jack watched them go, a renewed sense of purpose settling over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the community he had come to love. The calm before the storm ends as night fell once again. The bakery stood like a beacon of defiance in the otherwise quiet town. Jack sat in the back room, the live camera feeds displayed on his laptop. His preparations were complete, and he was ready for whatever came next. Unbeknownst to him, the bikers were already on the move, their plan in motion. The sound of distant engines grew louder, signaling the start of the storm Jack had been waiting for. The town was cloaked in silence, save for the faint hum of motorcycle engines growing louder by the second. Blade and his gang crept closer to the bakery, their headlights off and movements deliberate. They split into two groups. one tasked with sabotaging Jack's truck, the other ready to attack the bakery. Snake led the group to Jack's pickup truck parked in the alley. Armed with crowbars and knives, they slashed the tires, shattered the windows, and cut the brake lines with practiced efficiency. The truck wasn't just disabled, it was destroyed. Meanwhile, Blade's team approached the bakery's front entrance. They carried cans of gasoline, a makeshift torch, and crowbars for prying open doors. Blade grinned wickedly as he poured the gasoline along the bakery's entrance, leaving a pungent trail that led to a pile of trash they dragged into the alley. With a flick of his lighter, Blade ignited the trail, the flames racing toward the bakery's front door. The fire roared to life, illuminating the darkness and casting eerie shadows across the town square. Inside, Jack was monitoring the surveillance feeds when he noticed the bikers creeping around. His eyes narrowed as he watched Snake's group vandalizing his truck. Then, the camera feed from the front door erupted in a flash of orange and yellow as the fire took hold. Jack moved quickly, grabbing his fire extinguisher and dashing toward the front door. He shoved it open, spraying foam at the growing flames. The fire hissed and sputtered as it died, but the bikers were ready for him. Blade and two others rushed him, crowbars swinging. Jack ducked under the first swing, his reflexes razor-sharp. He countered with a swift punch to the nearest biker's jaw, sending him sprawling. Blade lunged with his crowbar, aiming for Jack's ribs, but Jack sidestepped, grabbing Blade's wrist and twisting it until the weapon clattered to the ground. The third biker hesitated, clearly intimidated by Jack's skill. Jack seized the moment, delivering a calculated kick to the man's chest that sent him crashing into the bakery's outdoor seating. Unbeknownst to Jack, the bikers' actions were only the first phase of their plan. Blade had deliberately drawn Jack outside, while Snake's group prepared to storm the bakery from the back. As Jack finished dealing with the bikers at the front, Snake and his men slipped inside through the rear entrance, armed with chains and knives. Jack returned to the bakery, only to find the back room in chaos. Snake stood in the center, grinning as he swung a chain menacingly. "Miss me, old man?" Snake taunted, his voice dripping with malice. Jack didn't respond. He assessed the situation quickly. 4 bikers, all armed, and limited space to maneuver. He tightened his grip on the metal bar he'd picked up outside. Snake lunged first, the chain whistling through the air. Jack sidestepped, the chain narrowly missing his face, and used the momentum to drive the bar into Snake's ribs. The biker let out a guttural yell, stumbling backward. The others attacked simultaneously, but Jack's training kicked in. He moved like a shadow, blocking blows and countering with precise strikes. A knife-wielding biker aimed for his torso, but Jack disarmed him with a calculated wrist lock, sending the blade clattering to the floor. Another tried to grab Jack from behind, but Jack spun and delivered a brutal elbow to the man's temple. Despite Jack's skill, the bikers' sheer numbers began to take their toll. A well-aimed punch landed on Jack's side, and he staggered, momentarily winded. Sensing an opportunity, Snake lunged again, wrapping the chain around Jack's arm and pulling tight. Jack grimaced but didn't panic. He twisted his body, using Snake's momentum against him, and slammed the biker into a wall. The impact disoriented Snake, and Jack took the opportunity to free himself from the chain. Breathing heavily, Jack surveyed the room. 3 bikers were down, groaning in pain, but Snake was already recovering, his eyes burning with rage. "You're tougher than you look," Snake spat, wiping blood from his lip. "But you're not invincible." Jack didn't respond. He simply raised his fists, ready for the next round. Just as Snake was about to charge again, the sound of police sirens pierced the night air. The bikers froze, their bravado faltering. Someone in the neighborhood must have called the cops after hearing the commotion. Snake cursed under his breath. "This isn't over, old man," he growled, backing toward the door. Jack didn't move to stop him. He watched silently as the bikers retreated, their bikes roaring to life as they sped off into the night. As the sirens grew louder, Jack leaned against the counter, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The bakery was in shambles, but Jack felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had defended his home, his sanctuary, against overwhelming odds. When the police arrived, Jack gave a brief account of what had happened, leaving out certain details about his past and his preparations. The officers took notes and assured him They would patrol the area more frequently. As they left, Jack stood alone in the bakery, surveying the damage. He knew this wasn't the end. Blade and his gang would return, and next time, they'd be even more dangerous. But Jack was ready. The roar of motorcycles filled the air as Blade's gang regrouped at their usual hideout, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, the tension was palpable. Blade paced furiously, his leather boots clacking against the concrete floor, while the rest of the gang nursed their wounds. Snake, still wincing from the rib shot he'd taken from Jack, slammed a beer bottle onto the table. That old man isn't just some baker. He fights like he's been through a war. Blade shot him a glare. I don't care who he is. Nobody humiliates me and my crew like that. Nobody. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled fists. We're going back, and this time we're taking him down for good. No holding back. A murmur of agreement spread through the group, but there was a hint of hesitation in some of their eyes. Jack's skills had shaken them, and for the first time, the gang wasn't so sure of their invincibility. To bolster morale, Blade hatched a more calculated plan. This time, they wouldn't just attack head-on. They'd exploit Jack's perceived vulnerabilities. They decided to hit him where it hurt most, his livelihood and his reputation. Over the next few days, the bikers began their campaign of harassment. They spray-painted graffiti on the bakery's walls, slashing words like "coward" and "old man" across the pristine facade. They broke into delivery trucks, stealing supplies and scattering them across the parking lot. One night, they even poisoned a batch of flour by dumping motor oil into it. When Jack discovered the sabotage, he was livid but careful to handle it discreetly. He called in a new shipment and spent hours cleaning the bakery to ensure no traces of the oil remained. The townsfolk noticed the escalating harassment. Customers whispered among themselves, wondering why anyone would target Jack's bakery. A few loyal patrons offered to help, but Jack politely declined. This was his fight, and he didn't want anyone else getting hurt. Jack wasn't idle during these attacks. While the bikers focused on their petty sabotage, he worked behind the scenes to strengthen his defenses. He upgraded the bakery's security system, installing additional cameras and motion detectors. He fortified the doors and windows with reinforced steel and strategically placed traps around the property. Nothing lethal, but enough to deter intruders. He also began training again, pushing his body to the limits like he used to during his Navy SEAL days. Mornings were spent jogging through the woods, afternoons practicing hand-to-hand combat, and evenings sharpening his marksmanship with the weapons he kept in a hidden safe. Though he preferred not to use lethal force, Jack knew the bikers wouldn't stop until they were taught a lesson they'd never forget. As the harassment escalated, the townsfolk grew increasingly concerned. The bakery wasn't just a business. It was a cornerstone of the community. Parents brought their kids there after school, couples enjoyed its cozy atmosphere, and the elderly appreciated Jack's friendly demeanor. At a town hall meeting, several residents voiced their support for Jack. "We can't let these thugs terrorize one of our own," one man said, slamming his fist on the table. Sheriff Carter, an aging lawman with a soft spot for Jack, assured the crowd he was doing everything he could. But deep down, Carter knew his resources were limited. The bikers were dangerous, and confronting them head-on could lead to more violence. Jack appreciated the community's support but insisted on handling the situation himself. He didn't want innocent people caught in the crossfire. Back at the hideout, Blade finalized his plan for the ultimate strike. This time, they wouldn't just vandalize the bakery, they'd destroy it completely. Blade envisioned flames engulfing the building, smoke rising into the night sky as a symbol of their dominance. "We'll hit him when he least expects it," Blade announced, his voice filled with venom. "Middle of the night, no witnesses. We'll burn it to the ground and teach that old man he can't mess with us." The gang cheered, their confidence bolstered by Blade's fiery speech. They spent the next day gathering supplies, gasoline, Molotov cocktails, and even fireworks to amplify the destruction. But Blade didn't realize that Jack had been watching. Using his upgraded surveillance system, Jack had monitored the bikers' movements and overheard snippets of their conversations. He knew their plan, and he was ready. As night fell, Jack transformed the bakery into a fortress. He set up additional traps, positioned makeshift barricades, and prepared his weapons. Every step he took was calculated, every decision rooted in years of training and experience. He didn't relish the thought of violence, but he knew there was no other way. The bikers had pushed too far, and now they were bringing the fight to him. In the dim light of his office, Jack sat quietly, his mind focused and clear. He thought about his time in the Navy SEALs, the missions he'd completed, and the comrades he'd lost. This wasn't just about defending his bakery, it was about standing up to bullies, protecting the town he called home, and proving that even in retirement, he was still a force to be reckoned with. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Jack took one last deep breath and whispered to himself, "Let them come." The distant rumble of engines shattered the midnight silence. Jack stood in the darkened bakery, his eyes focused on the security monitors. The grainy footage revealed a line of motorcycles approaching, their headlights cutting through the night like predatory eyes. The bikers arrived in force, their numbers bolstered by a few additional recruits. Blade led the pack, his face twisted with rage and determination. They parked their bikes in a semicircle around the bakery, their leather jackets gleaming in the moonlight. Blade dismounted, clutching a gas can in one hand and a lighter in the other. "Tonight, we end this," he shouted, his voice echoing across the empty street. The gang cheered, their confidence renewed by their sheer numbers and the destructive tools they carried. Jack watched from the shadows, his muscles tense but his mind calm. He had spent his entire career mastering the art of tactical combat, and tonight would be no different. The bikers began spreading gasoline around the building, forming a trail that led back to their starting point. Snake held a bundle of Molotov cocktails, grinning as he lit one and tossed it onto the bakery's lawn. The small explosion sent flames licking at the grass, illuminating the gang's faces in an eerie glow. But as Blade prepared to ignite the gasoline trail, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the night. A metallic clang, followed by a yelp of pain. One of the bikers had tripped a wire Jack had set, triggering a spring-loaded contraption that sent a bucket of icy water crashing down on his head. The gang burst into laughter at their comrades' expense, but their amusement was short-lived. From the rooftop, Jack made his presence known. "You've had your fun," he called out, his voice calm but commanding. "This is your last chance to walk away." The bikers froze, scanning the shadows for the source of the voice. Blade sneered, stepping forward. "And what if we don't, old man? What are you gonna do? Bake us a cake?" Without responding, Jack acted. He tossed a smoke grenade down into the crowd, enveloping the bikers in a thick, choking cloud. Chaos erupted as they coughed and stumbled, their vision obscured. Using the confusion to his advantage, Jack descended from the roof with the agility of a man half his age. He moved like a shadow, striking quickly and efficiently. One biker swung a tire iron at him, but Jack ducked and countered with a precise elbow to the jaw, sending the man sprawling. Another came at him with a chain, swinging it wildly. Jack sidestepped the attack, grabbing the chain and using it to disarm his opponent. With a swift kick, he sent the biker crashing into a stack of crates. Blade, furious at the sight of his men falling, roared and charged at Jack with a crowbar. Jack stood his ground, deflecting the first swing and retaliating with a palm strike to Blade's sternum. The gang leader staggered but quickly recovered, his eyes burning with hatred. The bikers regrouped, attacking Jack in waves. They underestimated his stamina and skill, thinking their numbers would overwhelm him. But Jack was relentless, his movements a blur of precision and power. He used his environment to his advantage, luring the bikers into traps he had set earlier. One stepped onto a pressure plate, triggering a net that yanked him off his feet and left him dangling from a tree. Another stumbled into a tripwire, setting off a flashbang that temporarily blinded him. The townsfolk, awakened by the commotion, began gathering at a safe distance to watch the spectacle unfold. They couldn't believe their eyes. Jack, their quiet and unassuming baker, was taking on an entire gang and holding his own. Sheriff Carter arrived, sirens blaring, but he hesitated to intervene. He knew Jack could handle himself, and part of him wanted to see how the confrontation would play out. As the fight raged on, the bikers began to falter. Their bravado faded as they realized they were outmatched. Blade, however, refused to back down. He rallied his remaining men, urging them to make one final push. "Don't let him win," Blade shouted. "Don't let him win," Blade shouted. "We're the kings of steel, and nobody messes with us. But Jack wasn't intimidated. He faced Blade directly, his gaze steady and unyielding. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and firm. The two men clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, their strikes echoing through the night. Blade was strong and aggressive, but Jack was disciplined and methodical. He dodged Blade's wild swings, landing precise blows that chipped away at the gang leader's strength. Finally, with a swift and calculated move, Jack disarmed Blade and pinned him to the ground. The other bikers, seeing their leader defeated, dropped their weapons and backed away, their confidence shattered. Jack stood, his breathing steady despite the intensity of the fight. He looked at the defeated gang, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "This is your last warning," he said. "If you come after me or my bakery again, you won't just lose a fight. You'll lose everything." The bikers, now fully aware of who they were dealing with, didn't argue. They helped Blade to his feet and slunk away, their motorcycles roaring as they sped off into the night. The crowd erupted into cheers, rushing forward to congratulate Jack. Sheriff Carter approached, tipping his hat. "You've still got it, Jack," he said with a grin. Jack nodded, his usual modesty returning. "Just doing what needed to be done." As the bikers roared away into the distance, the quiet of the night settled over the bakery. The crowd of townsfolk, still in awe of what they had witnessed, gradually dispersed, each person offering words of gratitude and admiration to Jack before heading home. Some called him a hero, others a legend, but Jack simply nodded, his focus already shifting to the mess left behind. Sheriff Carter lingered, standing beside Jack as they surveyed the scene. The lawn was scorched in patches from the Molotov cocktail, and the front of the bakery showed signs of the skirmish. Scuffs on the walls, a broken window, and the faint smell of smoke still hanging in the air. "You sure you're okay?" Carter asked, his tone a mix of concern and respect. Jack glanced at the sheriff, his face calm but tired. "I'm fine. Just another chapter in the book, I suppose." Carter chuckled. "Another chapter? Jack, you just wrote a whole damn novel tonight. You sure you're not interested in rejoining the Navy or something? I hear they could use someone like you." Jack smirked but shook his head. "That part of my life is over, Carter. I've got a bakery to run, and a community to feed." The next morning, Jack was up before sunrise as usual. He began cleaning up the mess, starting with the broken window on the scorched lawn. As he worked, the first of his regular customers arrived. A small group of elderly women who came by every morning for coffee and pastries. "Oh, Jack," one of them exclaimed, her hands flying to her mouth as she took in the damage. "We heard about what happened last night. Are you all right?" Jack smiled gently, wiping his hands on a towel. "I'm fine, Mrs. Palmer. Just a little late-night excitement, that's all." Word spread quickly through the town, and by mid-morning, dozens of people had gathered outside the bakery, eager to help. Some brought tools and supplies, while others offered food and moral support. "We can't let our town hero fix this place all by himself," one man said, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "I'm no hero," Jack replied, though his gratitude was evident. "But I appreciate the help. As the community worked together to restore the bakery, a delivery truck pulled up, its cargo a mystery. The driver handed Jack a clipboard to sign, then opened the truck to reveal a brand new state-of-the-art security system, complete with cameras, alarms, and reinforced doors and windows. "What's this?" Jack asked, bewildered. The driver smiled. "Anonymous donor. Said you'd know who it was." Jack's mind immediately went to his old Navy SEAL team. Though he hadn't spoken to many of them in years, he knew they still kept tabs on each other. It was their way. Silent support, always ready to step in when needed. Meanwhile, the bikers were dealing with the consequences of their actions. Blade's pride was shattered, and the gang's reputation was in tatters. News of their defeat had spread, and rival gangs were quick to mock them. Blade, nursing his wounds and simmering with rage, tried to rally his men for another attack. But the others wanted no part of it. "You don't get it, Blade," Snake said, shaking his head. "That guy's not just some baker. He's trained, better than any of us could ever be. We go after him again. We're signing our death warrants." Reluctantly, Blade was forced to concede. The Kings of Steel disbanded shortly after, their reign of intimidation and chaos brought to an abrupt and humiliating end. That evening, as the bakery's repairs were nearly complete, Jack sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, and the town was peaceful once more. Sheriff Carter joined him, pulling up a chair. "You ever think about why you ended up here, Jack? In a quiet little town running a bakery of all things?" Jack considered the question, his gaze distant. "I've seen enough chaos for a lifetime, Carter. I wanted a place where I could find some peace, where I could create something good." Carter nodded. "Well, you've done that, and more. This town's lucky to have you." Jack took a sip of his coffee, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm the lucky one. For the first time in years, I feel like I belong." As the weeks passed, life in the town returned to normal, though Jack's legend continued to grow. People spoke of the quiet baker who had stood up to a gang and won, his story inspiring others to stand up for themselves and their community. Jack, however, remained humble. To him, the fight wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about protecting the life he had built and the people he cared about. And so, the bakery flourished, becoming a symbol of resilience and unity. And Jack, the quiet warrior, finally found the peace he had been searching for. In the months that followed, Jack's life continued to settle into a peaceful rhythm. The bakery became a cornerstone of the community, and the people of the town came to regard Jack not just as the quiet, humble baker, but as something of a local hero. Yet, while Jack moved on, the events of that night haunted the bikers who had been involved. Blade, still licking his wounds and grappling with the embarrassment of his failed assault on Jack, found himself at a crossroads. The gang was all but disbanded, and his old sense of pride had been shattered. He couldn't escape the sting of defeat, not only from a retired Navy SEAL, but from a man who had made it clear that he didn't seek any recognition. One evening, Blade found himself sitting alone at a bar, nursing a drink that had long since lost its flavor. Snake, one of his few remaining loyal members, slid onto the stool beside him. I can't stop thinking about that night," Blade muttered, his voice low with regret. "We were nothing compared to him. He took us down with just his fists and a damn stare." Snake didn't respond immediately. He had no words of comfort. None of them did. They were bikers, sure. But after that encounter, the danger and thrill of fighting seemed trivial. The reality of what they had done, the lives they had ruined, began to sink in, and with that realization came the understanding that they had been nothing more than bullies. "You need to do something, Blade," Snake said quietly. "Make it right." Blade looked at him, the old stubborn fire still flickering in his eyes. "I don't know if I can. I don't even know where to start." The rest of the night passed in a fog of silence. Neither man could shake the image of Jack standing tall, his fists clenched, not for glory or revenge, but simply to defend what was his. The request for redemption. A week later, Blade made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He reached out to Sheriff Carter, asking for a meeting. He wanted to make amends for what had happened. Blade was tired of running and hiding from the past. The meeting was set in Carter's office. When Blade walked in, there was an air of tension, but also a sense of resolve. Sheriff Carter, ever the professional, took a long look at Blade before speaking. "Why the sudden change of heart, Blade? After everything, you want to play the hero now?" Blade clenched his fists, but his gaze softened. "I don't want to be a hero. I just want to stop being a damn coward. I don't care about my reputation anymore. I've seen enough to know that what we did to Jack, it was wrong. And I'm ready to own up to it." Carter regarded him for a moment, his brow furrowed in contemplation. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke. "Then prove it. Actions speak louder than words. You want to make it right? You know where to start." Blade nodded, a sense of purpose slowly replacing the anger and bitterness he had lived with for so long. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, Blade felt like he was on the right path. The apology. The next morning, Blade stood in front of Jack's bakery, his hand shaking. He had tried to come up with the right words, but none seemed adequate for the apology he needed to make. He could still feel the weight of what he had done. Jack, who had been sweeping the front porch, looked up and froze when he saw Blade approaching. For a moment, Jack didn't know what to expect. The last time he had seen this man, it had been in a violent confrontation. But now, there was something different in Blade's posture. "Jack," Blade called, his voice hoarse. He stopped, taking a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. I owe you a lot more than that, actually. What we did to you, what I led my men to do, was wrong. I didn't know who you were, but I should have never taken it that far." Jack looked at him, his expression unreadable, but his heart heavy with the knowledge that even the toughest of men could change. After a long silence, he nodded slowly. "I've been where you are, Blade. I've been on the other side doing things I'm not proud of, but I chose to move on. You have that choice now too." Jack's voice was steady, but there was a quiet understanding in his eyes. "You can either keep fighting, or you can build something better." Blade swallowed hard, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. "I'm done fighting," he said quietly, "and I'll prove it." The new path. Over the next few weeks, Blade began working at Jack's bakery. It wasn't a grand gesture, and it didn't come with fanfare. Blade simply showed up every morning, ready to do whatever needed to be done. From baking bread to sweeping floors, he was there, and he never once asked for special treatment. The town was skeptical at first. Blade's reputation was hard to shake, but slowly, over time, the people of the town began to see him in a new light. He wasn't the ruthless biker gang leader anymore. He was just a man trying to make amends for his past mistakes. And Jack, as always, was there to offer guidance. He didn't push Blade to be anything more than he was. Instead, he taught him what it meant to have patience, to be part of a community, and to work with integrity. Blade, in return, began to change. He stopped drinking, stopped looking for trouble. He focused on making things right, and slowly, his soul began to heal. Jack's legacy, meanwhile, the town continued to flourish. The bakery had become more than just a place for bread and pastries. It had become a sanctuary, a symbol of resilience. And Jack, the quiet Navy SEAL who had chosen a life of peace, had become something of a legend. Jack's story spread beyond the town, inspiring people far and wide. His quiet strength, his refusal to back down, had taught everyone who met him that there was more to life than fighting. Sometimes, the real victory was in the moments of peace, in the choices we make to protect what truly matters. As for Blade, he continued to work at the bakery, his redemption slowly unfolding before his eyes. The pain from his past had not disappeared, but with every loaf of bread he baked, every small act of kindness he showed, he was building something far more lasting than any reputation he had once sought. And Jack, ever the humble warrior, continued his work, knowing that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in silence, and won with a single act of kindness. Even as Jack and Blade forged a new path forward, a sense of unease lingered in the background. The past had a way of creeping back when least expected. Though Blade had distanced himself from his former life, not everyone from his biker gang shared the same desire for redemption. One morning, as Jack was preparing for another busy day at the bakery, the doorbell chimed with the usual ring, signaling a customer. He looked up to see a group of bikers, their leather jackets and patchwork vests, a stark reminder of the very men who had once harassed him. The leader, a man with a deep scar running down the side of his face and a smirk that seemed to never leave, stepped forward. "Jack, right?" he said, his voice low and filled with menace. "I think we need to have a little talk." Jack's gaze hardened. He didn't recognize the man, but the tone of his voice was enough to set off an alarm in his head. He could sense the tension in the air, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," Jack said calmly, wiping his hands on a towel. "But if you're here for the usual, bread, coffee, then you're welcome to sit down. Otherwise, you should probably leave." The biker didn't move, his eyes narrowing. "We're not here for bread, Jack. We're here for answers." His eyes flicked to Blade, who had just entered the bakery, and for a moment, It felt like time stood still. Blade stood frozen by the counter, an expression of dread washing over his face. "Leave," Blade said, his voice low and hard. "Now." The scar-faced biker smirked. "Don't think you get to tell us what to do anymore. We're here to settle an old score. You're a traitor, Blade. You were once a part of something greater. You don't just walk away from that." Blade's moment of truth. Blade stepped forward, placing himself between Jack and the bikers. The conflict between them was not one of brute force anymore. It was one of resolve. Blade had turned his back on the life he once knew, but this was the moment he had to face it, once and for all. "Listen," Blade began, his voice quieter now, but his words cutting through the air like a blade itself. "I don't owe you anything anymore. Not my loyalty, not my fear. If you came here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. If you came here to hurt Jack, you'll have to go through me." The Scarface biker took a step back, assessing Blade. "You think you're some kind of hero now? You're a damn fool, Blade." Blade didn't respond immediately. He let the words linger in the air before replying, his voice dripping with finality. "You're right. I'm no hero. But I'm damn sure not your punching bag anymore." For a long moment, no one moved. Jack watched the standoff unfold before him, feeling a mixture of concern and admiration for Blade. Blade wasn't the man he had been when he first walked into the bakery. He was standing up for something greater than himself now, something that Jack had taught him through his own quiet example. The biker gang leader took a deep breath and let out a sharp laugh. "You think this is over? It's far from it, Blade. You may have left the gang, but the gang doesn't forget." Without another word, the bikers turned and walked out of the bakery, leaving the air thick with unresolved tension. Blade remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides, as Jack silently took in the exchange. "You Jack's calm wisdom?" Jack approached Blade slowly, his expression steady. "It's never really over, is it?" he said softly. Blade shook his head, a deep frustration building within him. "No, but I can't go back to that life. I can't keep running, and I can't keep hiding." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of Blade's words. "Then don't," he said simply. "But you've done the hard part, Blade. You've made the choice to walk away. The rest will come in time." The words settled in Blade's mind as he stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had finally found peace, but it was clear that some battles would not be fought in the shadows. The scars of the past would never fully disappear, and there would always be someone lurking, trying to pull him back into the chaos he had left behind. But Blade knew now that he was stronger than the life he had once led. He had Jack's support, and he had his own will to carry him forward. The question was no longer whether he could survive the threat. It was whether he could continue to stand tall when the past came knocking at his door again. The return of the storm as Blade finished the last of his shift at the bakery that day, the unease still weighed heavy on him. Despite Jack's calm wisdom, the fact remained that the bikers hadn't been scared off. They were still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The question lingered in Blade's mind: how long before they returned? How long before they tested him again? And more importantly, how long before they brought the fight to Jack's door? Blade couldn't afford to wait. The storm was coming, and it was only a matter of time before it arrived. As he stood outside the bakery, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he made a promise to himself. If the bikers returned, he wouldn't back down. This time, he had everything worth fighting for. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Jack and Blade continued their routines. Jack in the bakery, Blade keeping a low profile, but both knew that the bikers would return. The uneasy silence between them was a constant reminder that peace, though hard-won, was fragile. Blade spent his days preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He wasn't sure when the bikers would strike, but he knew that they wouldn't just walk away. It wasn't in their nature. The leader of the gang, scar-faced and relentless, had made it clear that Blade's defection wasn't something they would forget easily. And that meant Jack's bakery was now a target. Blade spent more time than usual in the back room of the bakery, working on a few repairs, sharpening his instincts, and ensuring he was ready for whatever came next. Jack, ever the optimist, tried to keep things light-hearted. He'd joke around and continue baking with his usual flair, but there was no mistaking the concern in his eyes. The bakery had been Blade's refuge, but now it felt like the calm before the storm. Blade couldn't shake the feeling that he was putting Jack in danger just by being there. Jack had never asked for any of this. He was a baker, a simple man with simple dreams. But now, his life was intertwined with Blade's past, and that past was catching up fast. The decision to fight back one evening, as Blade closed up the bakery for the night, he caught Jack staring out the window, his hands resting on the counter, the weight of something unsaid between them. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" Blade said, his voice breaking the silence. Jack turned to face him, his gaze steady. "Thinking about what?" "About what happens if they come back. About what happens to you if they do." Jack paused, looking at Blade with an understanding that made Blade's heart ache. "It's not just you they're after, Blade. It's me too. And you've already been through enough." Blade's jaw tightened. "You didn't ask for this, Jack. You didn't sign up for any of it." Jack gave a small shake of his head. "You don't get to decide that for me. You're my friend, Blade, and I won't just stand by and let anyone hurt you, or me, for that matter." For a moment, the words hung between them. It was clear now that Jack wasn't just a baker caught in the crossfire. He had become part of Blade's battle, and Blade knew that he had to protect him at all costs. "I've been running from this my whole life," Blade said quietly. "But I'm not running anymore. I'm going to fight. And if they come after you, we'll deal with it together." Jack nodded slowly, his expression serious. "We'll deal with it together." Jack nodded slowly, his expression serious. "We'll deal with it together." The first attack of the next day, Blade's fears came true. It started like any other morning. Jack arrived early to open the bakery, setting the fresh loaves of bread out on the counter. Blade, as usual, was there to help out with the prep work, quietly watching the street through the window. And then, just as Jack was preparing a batch of his famous cinnamon rolls, the door swung open. This time, the bikers didn't bother with the subtle approach. They stormed into the bakery, the leader at the front, flanked by two of his most loyal followers. Blade's body went rigid, every muscle tensed for action. He could feel the air shift as the bikers entered, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. The scar-faced leader gave Jack a cold smile. "I told you, Blade," he said, his voice thick with venom. "You can't outrun your past." Jack stood frozen behind the counter, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "This is a bakery, not a battleground. You're not welcome here." The leader ignored Jack, turning his attention to Blade. "We're not here to talk, Blade. We're here to finish this once and for all." Blade's eyes never left the scar-faced biker. His hands flexed at his sides, ready for anything. He wasn't about to let this group of thugs tear apart his life again, and he wasn't about to let them harm Jack. He took a step forward, his tone firm but calm. "You don't get to decide that," Blade said. "Not here, not now." The leader grinned, a sickly smile. "I think you've forgotten who's in charge here." Blade wasn't about to waste time on words. Without warning, he moved with the speed and precision of someone who had spent years honing his instincts in battle. The first biker lunged toward him, but Blade was already a step ahead. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground in one swift motion. The scar-faced leader's eyes widened, clearly surprised by Blade's speed. But Blade wasn't done yet. He was faster now, stronger, and more determined than ever before. The second biker charged, but Blade met him head-on, using his knee to knock the man off balance before delivering a precise punch to his ribs. The thug crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. The scar-faced leader took a step back, his expression shifting from confident to wary. He clearly underestimated Blade, and now he was paying the price for it. Jack, who had been standing frozen behind the counter, finally stepped forward, his voice shaking but strong. "You've caused enough damage already. It's over." The scar-faced leader sneered, but didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for his remaining followers to back off, realizing the fight wasn't going in their favor. Aftermath, as the bikers retreated, the tension in the bakery didn't immediately dissipate. Blade stood, breathing heavily, his body wired with adrenaline. Jack looked at him, his face a mixture of relief and awe. That was incredible. Blade wiped the sweat from his brow, his voice hoarse. I didn't want it to come to that, but I wasn't going to let them hurt you. Jack nodded. I'll never understand how you can stay so calm in situations like that. But I'm glad you're on my side. Blade gave him a weary smile. I've been in worse situations. But the threat wasn't over. The scar-faced leader had been humiliated in front of his gang, and Blade knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. He could feel the storm building again. But this time, Blade wasn't going to let fear control him. This time, he was ready. The days after the first confrontation were tense. Blade and Jack had been through a lot, but neither of them was under any illusion that this was over. The bikers weren't the type to accept defeat easily, especially not from someone they saw as an outsider. Blade had come to realize that the only way to end this cycle was to fight back. For good. Jack was quieter now, more reflective. He had seen the consequences of Blade's past catch up with him, and it had affected him deeply. Despite all the jokes and the comfort Blade had brought into his life, Jack was aware that the danger wasn't just a fleeting moment. The bikers were coming back. And next time, they wouldn't be so easily defeated. Blade spent the next few days preparing. He wasn't just training his body. No, this time, he was getting into the mind of his enemies, analyzing their every move, anticipating what they would do. He wasn't about to make the same mistake again. He had underestimated the gang, and that mistake had cost him time. But Blade wasn't about to let his guard down again. This time, it was going to be different. Jack, for his part, had been helping where he could. He knew Blade had his reasons for keeping certain things secret, but Jack didn't need the details. He had seen enough to understand that Blade was more than capable of handling whatever came his way. The baker was determined to stay by his side, offering his support however he could, whether it was securing the bakery or making sure they had the tools they needed to defend themselves. But it wasn't just about physical preparation. It was about strategy. The bikers had been reckless the first time, thinking they could bully their way into controlling the situation. This time, Blade wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He would turn their arrogance against them. She would turn their arrogance against them. The biker gangs returned. It was late in the afternoon when they returned. Blade had just finished preparing the final batch of pastries for the day, and Jack was cleaning up behind the counter. The bakery was quiet, the scent of freshly baked bread hanging in the air. It should have been peaceful, but Blade felt the familiar tension coil in his gut. His instincts had been screaming at him all day that something was coming. Sure enough, the sound of motorcycles grew louder as they neared the bakery. Blade moved to the back, quietly positioning himself near the door. Jack turned, his face paling as he saw the familiar bikes pull into the parking lot. The leader, scar-faced and cold, was the first to step off his bike. This time, however, there was something different in the air. The gang wasn't here just for a confrontation. Blade could feel it in the way they moved, the way the leader's eyes scanned the area. They weren't just looking for a fight, they were looking for dominance. You again, Jack said, his voice betraying a mix of frustration and fear. What do you want this time? The leader smirked. You should have known it was never over, Jack. You really think you could just bring someone like him into this town and expect it all to be fine? No, it's time to finish what we started. Blade emerged from the shadows, stepping into the doorway between the back and the main area of the bakery. His eyes locked on to the scar-faced leader, unwavering. It's over when I say it's over. Why, say it's over. The confrontation. The bikers were armed, and their demeanor showed that they were expecting a fight. But Blade didn't back down. He was ready, his muscles tensed, every sense honed to perfection. The leader, no longer trying to hide his anger, motioned for the others to move in. Blade didn't hesitate. He lunged first, taking out the nearest biker with a single move, a swift punch to the chest that knocked the air out of the man. The others hesitated, momentarily stunned by Blade's speed. But that hesitation was all Blade needed. He was like a whirlwind, moving with precision, each strike calculated, each move made with the same deadly accuracy that had been drilled into him over the years. Jack, watching from behind the counter, felt a mixture of awe and fear. He had never seen Blade in action like this, and it was both terrifying and impressive. The bikers had thought they could walk in here and intimidate, but Blade was showing them what it meant to face a real threat. Blade wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for Jack, for the bakery, for everything that had become a part of his new life. The bikers, on the other hand, were nothing more than distractions, pawns in a game that had already been decided. The scar-faced leader snarled, his patience thinning. "You think you can just take us all down? You think you're some kind of hero?" Blade stopped mid-fight, locking eyes with the leader. "No, I'm not a hero. I'm just a man protecting what's mine." Without warning, the leader pulled out a knife, his eyes flashing with malice. He lunged toward Blade, but Blade was faster, using the environment to his advantage. With a quick sidestep, he grabbed the leader's wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. The leader's anger flared, but Blade wasn't about to give him a chance to recover. With a single well-placed strike, Blade incapacitated the man, sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining bikers, realizing their leader was down and out, started to retreat. But Blade wasn't done yet. At the turning point, Blade stepped forward, not allowing them the opportunity to regroup. His movements were deliberate, calculated, and in a few short seconds, the bikers were either down or on the run. There was no more posturing, no more intimidation. The fight had been decided. The bakery, once filled with tension, now stood silent. Jack, still behind the counter, stared at Blade with a mixture of disbelief and relief. That was incredible. Blade took a deep breath, the adrenaline beginning to subside. It's not over yet, but it will be. Aftermath, the bikers were gone, but the battle had left its mark. The street was quiet again, the sound of the motorcycles fading into the distance. Jack looked at Blade, his face a mix of gratitude and concern. "Oh, you did it," Jack said, his voice quiet. Blade nodded, but his expression was somber. "It's not over. They'll be back, and next time, it'll be worse." Jack knew Blade was right, but he also knew that they had won today. And for now, that was enough. And, in the aftermath of the confrontation, Blade had a new sense of determination. He wasn't just going to survive this. He wasn't going to let the bikers tear apart his new life, his bakery, or the friendships he had built with people like Jack. He had worked too hard to just sit back and wait for the next storm to hit. Blade knew that when you're in a war, whether physical or psychological, you don't wait for the enemy to make the next move. You make it for them. The bakery had always been more than just a business for Blade. It had been his sanctuary, a place where he could create something with his hands, something that wasn't associated with the violence of his past life. The smell of fresh bread and pastries was his escape, and he was not going to let that peace be shattered. But Jack wasn't blind to the dangers of Blade's situation. He saw the way Blade's eyes would sometimes go distant, as if he were preparing for something he couldn't fully control. Jack could sense that Blade had a plan, but he also knew that Blade wasn't going to share all the details. Not yet, anyway. Blade spent his days in the bakery, but his nights were filled with preparation. He was already strategizing for the bikers' inevitable return. This time, he would be ready. Blade started making calls to old contacts, some of them from his Navy SEAL days, others from the military community he had remained connected to. He wasn't going to let anything happen to the life he had built, and he was ready to fight back with everything he had. Jack noticed the change in Blade over the next few weeks. Blade's training had become more intense. He wasn't just lifting weights and running drills anymore. He was practicing with weapons, perfecting his hand-to-hand combat skills, and working on strategies for every possible scenario. It was clear that Blade wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was preparing for war. The unseen threat. As Blade worked behind the scenes, Jack did his best to maintain the bakery's normalcy. He kept the doors open, kept the coffee brewing, and kept the customers happy. But even though Blade was no longer openly training, Jack knew better than to think that the situation had calmed. Blade had a certain way of looking at things that Jack couldn't quite understand, a sort of quiet intensity that hinted at a mind always working. In the middle of all this, something strange began happening around town. A few more of the bikers had been spotted near the bakery, but they were always watching from a distance, never getting too close. It was almost as if they were waiting for something, waiting for Blade to make a mistake. Every time Jack went to the market, or took a walk down the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Blade had made enemies, and now those enemies were biding their time. One evening, Blade pulled Jack aside after closing hours, his face grim. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice low. "The bikers are planning something. They're not done with us." Jack's heart sank. "What do you mean? What are they planning?" Blade shook his head, his expression unreadable. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." Jack didn't need any further explanation. He trusted Blade, and if Blade thought something was coming, then Jack knew it was. The weight of the situation settled in, the tension in the air becoming thick. They had won the first battle, but this was far from over. The bikers were out there. The bikers' master plan. As the days passed, Blade's fears were confirmed. One night, as Blade sat in his small apartment above the bakery, going over the intel he had gathered, he realized just how deep the bikers' influence in the town ran. He had heard rumors of more biker gangs trying to make their way into the area. Blade's bakery had become a target not just for the local gang, but for others who saw it as an opportunity to expand their territory. But Blade wasn't going to let that happen. He would stop this before it got any worse. He knew the only way to take down an enemy like the bikers was to hit them where it hurt. And that meant taking the fight to their doorstep. Blade had connections, old allies who owed him favors. One of those was a former SEAL team member, who now worked as a private investigator. Blade had contacted him several times over the past few weeks, trying to gather information on the bikers' movements. The investigator had confirmed what Blade had feared. The bikers were planning something big, something that could change everything for Blade. Setting the trap, it wasn't long before Blade formulated a plan. He wasn't going to wait for the bikers to make their move. He was going to make it first. Blade knew the gang wouldn't come after him directly, not with the attention the first confrontation had brought to the bakery. But they would go after Jack. They always went after the people you cared about. Blade had been putting in the work on a secret project for weeks now. He'd been rigging the bakery with hidden cameras, setting up traps in key locations, and ensuring that everything was ready to go when the time came. Blade knew the bikers would try to intimidate Jack again, maybe even try to take him hostage. This time, though, they would find themselves walking right into a trap. The plan was simple: lure the bikers in, make them think they had the upper hand, then strike when they least expected it. Blade had no illusions about the danger of the situation. He knew there was a chance that things could go south, that the bikers could outnumber them or catch them off guard. But Blade was used to the odds being stacked against him. He had faced worse, and he had survived. The waiting game. The next few days passed in a tense silence. Jack went about his usual routine at the bakery, serving customers, keeping everything running smoothly. Blade watched from the shadows, constantly analyzing, waiting for the right moment to put his plan into motion. But Blade wasn't the only one on edge. Jack had seen the changes in Blade. The sleepless nights, the anxious looks, the sense of urgency that hung over everything Blade did. Jack had always thought of Blade as a steady presence, a man who had everything under control. But now, it was clear that Blade wasn't just fighting for his bakery or his life. He was fighting for everything he had built. Jack didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Blade fight this battle alone. The quiet before the storm didn't last long. On a cold, moonlit night, the first signs of trouble surfaced. Blade had just finished a late shift at the bakery, cleaning up and preparing for the next day. Jack had left earlier, saying he had a few errands to run. Blade was in the back, organizing ingredients, when he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. He tensed instantly, his muscles instinctively reacting to the sound. Through the window, Blade saw them. The bikers, a group of about 5, circled the bakery parking lot. Their engine growls filled the air, an unmistakable signal that the peace was about to be shattered. Blade's heart rate quickened, but his face remained calm. He wasn't about to show them fear. As he watched them approach, he could see the malicious grins on their faces. They were back, and this time they had something to prove. Blade's training kicked in. He moved quickly, locking the back door, slipping through the kitchen to a side room where his weapons and equipment were stashed. He wasn't just going to sit back and wait this time. This was his time to strike back. The bikers pulled up and dismounted, swaggering toward the front door of the bakery. Blade knew they were likely looking for a confrontation. They weren't the kind to just come and go. This was about power, about sending a message. As they stepped onto the porch, Blade moved silently to the front window, peering out through the blinds. The bikers were in full gear now, leather jackets adorned with patches and symbols that signified their allegiance to one another. Their leader, a man known as Viper, stepped forward. He had a reputation for being ruthless, and Blade knew from his past experience that this wasn't just a casual visit. Viper had a plan, and Blade could feel the weight of the situation closing in on him. Jack hadn't returned yet, and Blade knew it wouldn't be long before things escalated. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. He had set up hidden cameras all over the bakery, but now, with the bikers so close, he had to act. When an unexpected visitor, Blade decided to make his move before they could intimidate Jack. But just as he was about to head out the back door, the unexpected happened. The bell above the front door chimed, and Blade froze. Jack had returned, completely unaware of the biker's presence. He walked in casually, as though nothing was amiss, his arms full of bags from the market. "Hey, Blade!" Jack's voice trailed off as he saw the biker standing near the counter, eyeing him up and down. "Evening, boys," Jack said with a forced grin, trying to play it cool, but his posture was tense, his instinct kicking in. The air was thick with tension. Blade's heart raced, but he remained in the shadows, assessing the situation. "Got a problem with the bakery?" Jack continued, keeping his tone light, even though he could tell these weren't ordinary customers. "They were there for something more than pastries," Viper smirked, taking a slow step forward. "Nah, just came to see the guy who thinks he can take over our territory. I gotta say, it's cute. A bakery? Really? You think you can make it here? Really? You think you can make it here?" Blade was seething with frustration. He had hoped that Jack would stay out of this, but now it was clear that his worst fears were coming true. The bikers were here to send a message, and they were using Jack as leverage. Jack stood his ground, his jaw tight. "We've been through this before. You're not welcome here, and I don't want any more trouble." Viper's smile faded slightly, but his eyes glinted with menace. "I think you'll find that trouble's already here, friend." With a quick gesture, the bikers began moving around the bakery, positioning themselves as though they were setting up for something. Blade's mind was working overtime. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They were making a statement, and they were about to escalate. Attention reaches a breaking point. Blade stepped quietly through the back kitchen, reaching for his phone. It was time to make a call. He had warned his former SEAL team member to be on standby, and now it was time for that help to come through. He dialed the number and pressed the phone to his ear. The line clicked as it connected. "Is it time?" The voice on the other end asked, calm and steady. Blade didn't hesitate. "It's time. Get your team in position. We're about to deal with some unwanted guests." The last standout. By the time Blade hung up, the bikers had already begun causing trouble. They were knocking over chairs, taunting Jack, and clearly trying to provoke a reaction. Blade could hear the laughter from the front of the bakery, and it made his blood boil. He wasn't going to let them destroy the one thing that had meant more to him than anything in the world. He moved swiftly, his mind calculating his every move. There was no room for error. Every second counted. Suddenly, the door slammed open, and a loud voice rang out. "All right, enough with the games." It was Jack. He had finally had enough. The tension was unbearable as Jack squared up, looking the bikers dead in the eye. "You want trouble?" he said, his voice low, but full of confidence. "Then, let's have it." Before Blade could react, the situation escalated. Viper stepped toward Jack, a knife glinting in the dim light. Blade's instincts took over. In one fluid motion, He burst through the back door and slammed into Viper, knocking the knife from his hand before the bikers could react. The battle begins. The room exploded into chaos. Blade moved like lightning, taking out one biker after another with calculated precision. Jack joined in, surprising the bikers with a strength they hadn't anticipated. With Blade leading the charge, the bikers were thrown into disarray. Viper, realizing that his gang was losing control, turned to make a run for it. Blade wasn't going to let him get away that easily. With a speed that only years of training could instill, Blade caught Viper by the arm, spun him around, and slammed him against the counter. "Not so fast," Blade growled. He was done playing games. The bikers had underestimated him, and now they were going to pay the price. The sudden burst of violence left the bakery in an eerie silence. The bikers lay scattered, groaning in pain on the floor. Blade stood over them, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline that surged through his veins. Jack, equally winded, leaned against the counter, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. The fight had been swift, but brutal. The bikers were disoriented, their initial confidence shattered by the sheer ferocity of Blade and Jack's counterattack. Blade knew they wouldn't be out of commission for long, but at least for now, the threat was neutralized. Viper, the leader, groaned as Blade tightened his grip on his collar, lifting him up. His eyes were wild, filled with a mix of pain and anger. His eyes were wild, filled with a mix of pain and anger. "Who the hell are you?" Viper spat, his voice raspy. He was trying to play the tough guy, but Blade could see the fear flickering in his eyes. Blade leaned in close, his voice a cold whisper. "You messed with the wrong guy. I'm a retired Navy SEAL, and I don't take kindly to threats." Viper sneered, but there was something in his eyes that made Blade believe he understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just some random fight. Blade wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated. This was a man who had faced far worse than a few bikers in leather jackets. Jack stepped forward, his face stoic. "You should have stayed out of our town," he said, his voice firm. He wasn't just standing by. He was part of this too. Jack wasn't the type to back down, even from an opponent as dangerous as Viper. The bikers, now fully realizing the gravity of their mistake, started to struggle, trying to push themselves off the ground. But Blade wasn't done yet. He needed to make sure this was the last time they would ever think of coming back. The tensions mount. The bikers, humiliated and defeated, began to back off, retreating towards the door. But Viper wasn't ready to give up yet. He struggled in Blade's grip, trying to break free. "You think this is over?" Viper growled. "We'll be back, you hear me? This isn't the end." Blade's grip tightened, and for a moment the air seemed to freeze. He leaned in even closer, his voice a deadly whisper. "You're not coming back. If you do, you'll regret it. If you do, you'll regret it." The words hung in the air like a promise. Blade wasn't making idle threats. He had spent years taking down enemies who were far more dangerous than Viper and his gang. The bikers, now fully aware of who they were dealing with, nodded in reluctant agreement. "I'll remember you," Viper spat, still defiant, though it was clear he knew when to stop. With one last shove, Blade let Viper go, sending him stumbling backward into his gang. The bikers didn't need any further encouragement. They fled, scrambling out of the bakery with the same haste they had shown when they arrived. As the door slammed shut behind them, Blade turned to Jack, who was still catching his breath. The tension in the air was palpable. Jack wiped his face, looking around at the mess the bikers had left. "Well," he said with a small chuckle, "I guess we've made our point." Blade nodded. "They won't be back, not after this." The return of the adrenaline from the fight still buzzed in Blade's system as he surveyed the bakery. There was broken glass, overturned chairs, and the lingering scent of sweat and blood in the air. But despite the destruction, Blade felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, he had taken control of his life, and the bikers had learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Blade pulled it out, his heart racing as he glanced at the screen. It was a message from his former SEAL team member. "All clear. You okay?" Blade took a deep breath and texted back. "We're good. The bikers won't be back." His team had done their job. They had made sure the situation didn't escalate further. Blade's instincts had been right. The bikers were just a small problem compared to the forces that had once threatened his life. But now, they were just another footnote in his story, an unlikely ally. As Blade looked over the damage, he heard a faint sound from the back. Turning, he saw someone standing in the doorway. It was Mrs. Green, the elderly woman who lived next door. She had been a constant presence in the bakery's life, often stopping by for her daily pastries or chatting with Blade when he needed a break. But tonight, her usual gentle demeanor was replaced by a look of concern. "I heard the noise," she said softly, her eyes scanning the room. "Is everything all right?" Blade walked over to her, his voice calmer now. "Yeah, we're good. Just had a little issue with some unwanted visitors. But it's over." Mrs. Green raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Unwanted visitors? My, you've got a way of handling things, don't you?" Blade gave her a small smile. "It's nothing. Just some old friends from my past." "Old friends?" "Oh," Mrs. Green asked. Her curiosity piqued. She had known Blade for years, but she had never heard him speak of his past in such a cryptic way. He had always been private, but tonight, something in her tone made him consider opening up. For a brief moment, Blade hesitated. He had kept his past buried for so long, never allowing anyone to see the truth of who he was. But in this moment, with everything that had just transpired, he realized that he didn't need to hide anymore. Maybe it was time to tell someone. He took a deep breath. "I used to be in the military, Navy SEAL. I'm retired now, but the past, it doesn't always stay behind you." Mrs. Green's expression softened. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I had no idea, dear. I'm just glad you're okay." Blade looked at her, a rare sense of gratitude flooding through him. "Thanks, Mrs. Green. That means a lot." The final lesson as the night wore on, and Blade cleaned up the bakery. His mind wandered. He had always kept his past a secret, buried deep inside him. But now, after everything that had happened, Blade realized that maybe it was time to stop running from it. He wasn't just a man who had retired from the military. He was someone who had lived through unimaginable horrors. Someone who had fought to protect not just his country, but everything he held dear. And tonight, he had proven that even though he had left that life behind, the skills and instincts of a Navy SEAL were never truly gone. Blade smiled to himself. He had won this round, but he knew that the world didn't stop spinning, and the next challenge was just around the corner. For now, though, the bakery was safe, and that was enough. The days following the confrontation with the bikers were filled with a sense of peace that Blade hadn't felt in a long time. The bakery, though a little battered from the fight, had become a symbol of resilience. Blade and Jack worked tirelessly to repair the damage, replacing windows, cleaning up the mess, and fixing up the interior. But it wasn't just about the physical repairs. There was a deeper sense of healing that had begun, a shift that Blade hadn't expected. It was late one afternoon when Mrs. Green returned to the bakery. Her face was marked with concern, but also a hint of curiosity. Blade noticed her immediately as she stepped through the door, holding a small basket in her hands. "Good afternoon," she greeted, her voice soft but steady. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." Blade wiped his hands on his apron and smiled, grateful for her presence. "Hey, Mrs. Green, everything's coming along. It'll look good as new soon." Mrs. Green set the basket down on the counter and motioned for Blade to sit with her. "I brought you some fresh bread. Thought you might need a break. You've been working too hard." Blade nodded and sat down, the weight of his day finally starting to settle on him. "Thanks, Mrs. Green. I appreciate it. He picked up a piece of the warm bread, savoring its familiar scent. "You always know how to make me feel better." They sat in silence for a few moments, Blade savoring the taste of the bread, and letting the stillness of the bakery wrap around him. It was peaceful, and for once he felt like he could truly breathe. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Green said after a while, breaking the silence. "You've been through a lot, and from what I've gathered, you're no stranger to conflict. But I can't help but wonder if maybe this whole situation has brought up some old wounds." Blade glanced at her, surprised by her insight. "You're right. It has. I didn't expect that. But I guess it's hard to escape the past sometimes." Mrs. Green nodded sympathetically. "We all have our demons, don't we? But maybe it's time to let go of some of that anger. You don't have to fight every battle, Blade. There's peace to be found, too." Her words struck a chord within him. Blade had spent so much time living in the shadow of his past, always ready for the next fight, always bracing for the next threat. But maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to find a different kind of peace, one that didn't require constant confrontation. Well, opening up the next few days passed in a blur, with Blade working long hours in the bakery and trying to keep his thoughts focused on the present. He began to notice small shifts in himself. The constant tension in his shoulders eased, and he found himself taking more moments to relax. Blade even started to appreciate the quieter moments. The soft clink of the coffee mugs, the warm smell of baked goods filling the air, and the laughter of customers as they came and went. But it was during one of these quiet moments that something unexpected happened. As Blade worked behind the counter, the door opened, and a familiar face walked in. It was Sarah, a regular customer who had always been friendly, but whom Blade had never really spoken to outside of casual pleasantries. "Good morning, Blade," Sarah said, flashing him a warm smile. "How's everything going?" Blade paused, wiping his hands on a rag. He was about to offer his usual polite response when he caught a glimmer of something in Sarah's eyes. It was curiosity, but it wasn't the kind of curiosity that made him uncomfortable. Instead, it felt genuine. "It's going well," Blade replied. "We're still cleaning up from that incident last week, but things are getting back to normal." Sarah leaned against the counter, her eyes narrowing slightly in concern. "I heard about the bikers. You're all right, right? You didn't get hurt?" Blade smiled, trying to keep the conversation light. "Nah, I'm fine. A few bruises here and there, but nothing serious." Sarah studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering on his face as if searching for something. "You know, Blade," she said softly, "there's a lot more to you than just the bakery, isn't there?" The question hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Blade felt a pang of vulnerability. He wasn't used to people probing into his life, especially not like this, but something in Sarah's tone made him feel like he could trust her, even just a little. He took a deep breath, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. The bakery was relatively quiet, with just a few customers scattered around. "I've had a complicated past," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Things aren't always as simple as they seem." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "I can tell. There's something about you that's different. It's not just the way you carry yourself, but the way you handle things. You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Blade met her gaze, feeling an unfamiliar urge to open up. It had been so long since he'd allowed anyone to see the real him, the man behind the seal, behind the scars. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "I've seen a lot of things, done a lot of things I'm not proud of, but I'm done with all that now." Sarah smiled warmly, as though she understood more than Blade had expected. "You know, it's okay to let go of the past. You don't have to carry it with you forever." For the first time in a long time, Blade felt like someone understood. There was a weight that lifted from his shoulders, just a little. It wasn't a solution, but it was a step in the right direction. The path forward. As the days turned into weeks, Blade began to realize that the bakery was no longer just a place to make a living. It had become a sanctuary for him, a place where he could rebuild his life and his sense of self. The quiet moments spent with customers like Sarah, the simple joy of baking bread and pastries, and the conversations with people who genuinely cared were slowly healing the wounds that he had carried for so long. The tension that had once defined Blade's existence began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. He wasn't running from his past anymore, but he also wasn't defined by it. Blade had started to build a new life, one that didn't revolve around violence or fear. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. It had been several weeks since the incident with the bikers, and Blade thought he was starting to settle into his new life. The bakery was thriving again, the repairs were complete, and the rhythm of daily life had returned. Blade's relationship with the community was slowly mending, and the fear of his past seemed to be fading away. He had found a place where he could breathe, where his history as a Navy SEAL was just another piece of who he was, rather than the sole defining characteristic. But Blade had learned long ago that peace was often fleeting, and fate had a way of testing his resolve when he least expected it. It was one of those mornings when the bakery was busiest, the air thick with the smell of freshly baked bread and the warm hum of conversation. Blade had just taken a tray of pastries out of the oven when the door swung open with a sharp, jarring sound. He looked up, his senses immediately alert. A group of 3 men entered, their heavy boots making the wooden floorboards creak with every step. Blade didn't need to look twice to know who they were. The same group of bikers who had caused the ruckus weeks ago. They walked in with an air of arrogance, as if they owned the place. Blade's stomach tightened, but he didn't show it. He had spent years training to keep his emotions in check, and today, more than ever, he would need that composure. The leader of the group, a burly man with tattoos crawling up his neck and arms, stepped forward. His eyes flicked over the bakery, scanning it with disdain. "Well, well," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "Look what we got here." The baker boy himself. Blade didn't flinch. "What do you want?" His voice was steady, but there was an underlying edge to it that the man noticed immediately. The biker grinned, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. "Just came to check out how things are going. You know, after all the trouble you caused." Blade's jaw tightened, but he didn't give in to the anger rising within him. He had come so far, worked so hard to leave the violence behind, and he wouldn't let these men drag him back into it. "Things are fine," Blade said coolly, "and if you're here to cause more trouble, you might want to leave." The biker stepped closer, his massive frame towering over Blade. "You think you're tough because you're some kind of ex-soldier? I don't care who you were. I don't care what you've done." Blade locked eyes with him, his heart racing but his expression calm. "I'm done with fighting, but if you want to make something out of this, we can step outside." The tension in the room thickened. The customers in the bakery were watching now, some with nervous glances, others with genuine concern. But Blade didn't care about the audience. His focus was entirely on the man in front of him, the same man who had tried to intimidate him before. But this time, there was something different in Blade's eyes, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. He was no longer trying to prove anything. The biker leader hesitated, sensing something had changed in Blade. His bravado faltered for just a moment. Blade took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The room was still, the only sound the muffled conversations of the customers who had grown unusually silent. "You can keep trying to bully me," Blade said, his voice low and measured, "but you'll find that I'm not the same person I was before. You've got one shot at leaving here without a fight. Walk out that door and I'll make sure you're never a problem again." For a moment, the biker leader looked like he might snap, but Blade's calmness seemed to disarm him. His eyes darted around the room as though searching for support. But the other 2 bikers were already backing off, glancing at each other uneasily. "All right, tough guy," the leader finally spat. "We'll let it go for now, but don't think this is over. You've got more enemies than you realize. You've got more enemies than you realize." With that, he turned and stormed out of the bakery, the other 2 following behind him. Blade stood there watching them leave. The door slammed behind them, and the room went silent for a moment. Blade's hands clenched, and his mind raced. He had come face to face with them, but more than that, he had faced something within himself. He hadn't needed to fight. He hadn't needed to prove anything, and for the first time in a long time, Blade felt a rush of something else, a sense of relief. The calm after the storm as the day went on. The usual bustle of the bakery resumed. Customers came and went, and the small town rhythm of life continued. But for Blade, something had shifted. The past few weeks had been a test, not just of his physical strength, but of his emotional endurance. He had come face to face with the demons that had haunted him for years, and he had won, not with force, but with his ability to stay calm, to stay centered. Jack, who had been watching from behind the counter, gave Blade a curious look. "You all right, man?" Blade took a deep breath, glancing around the bakery at the customers who were now talking among themselves, the tension from the bikers gone. "Yeah, I'm good. I think it's finally over." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Blade nodded, his eyes reflecting a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. "Yeah, it's over." Community support later that evening, after the bakery had closed. Blade sat down at one of the small tables with a cup of coffee in his hand. He stared out the window, the fading light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the quiet street. It had been a long day, but the events with the bikers had finally brought him the closure he needed. As he sat there, reflecting on the events, a soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Blade stood and opened it to find Mrs. Green standing there, holding a tray of homemade cookies. She smiled warmly as she handed them to him. "I thought you might need a little something after the day you've had," she said gently. She said gently. "You've been through a lot, Blade, but I think you've earned some peace now." Blade smiled, taking the cookies from her. "Thanks, Mrs. Green. I appreciate it." They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the evening settling in. It was in that moment that Blade realized something. His past didn't have to define him. He could choose to move forward, to let go of the violence, the anger, and the fear that had ruled his life for so long. He had already won, and now he could finally rest. It was a few months later when Blade finally stepped outside his bakery and looked around. The small town had become more than just a place to hide or survive. It had become his sanctuary. He had rebuilt his life from the ground up, brick by brick, bread loaf by bread loaf. And every morning when he opened the bakery doors, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The bikers had never returned. The memories of their threats and harassment faded over time, replaced with the comforting hum of daily life. The bakery was thriving. Blade's reputation had gone from being the quiet, mysterious baker to the dependable, respected man who had a way of making his customers feel welcome. Word had spread about his past, but rather than fueling fear or resentment, it seemed to spark admiration. The people in his town understood that Blade wasn't just a baker. He was a man who had faced the toughest battles imaginable and had chosen peace over violence. One chilly morning, as Blade prepared his famous cinnamon rolls for the day, Jack, his longtime friend, came into the kitchen with a box in hand. Blade raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" he asked. "A little something for you," Jack said, grinning. "You've earned it." Jack handed him the box, and Blade opened it to find a small framed picture. It was a picture of the bakery, taken just a few days ago, with a banner in the window that read, "Best Cinnamon Rolls in Town." Beneath the banner, the townspeople were laughing, chatting, and enjoying the food, some even sitting on the benches outside. It was a snapshot of Blade's new life, a life he had built not just from the dough in his bakery, but from the kindness and loyalty of the people around him. "Looks good," Blade said, smiling faintly. "You've come a long way, man," Jack said. "I think the bikers were the last chapter of that old life, don't you?" Blade nodded, his gaze lingering on the photo. "Yeah, they were. And now it's time for the next chapter." As Blade set the picture down, he turned his attention back to the ovens. The comforting smell of fresh bread filled the room once again, and for the first time in years, Blade felt the weight of his past lifting, replaced with the joy of a new beginning. He wasn't just a retired Navy SEAL anymore. He wasn't just the man who'd had to fight for everything. He was a man who had found peace, and more importantly, he had found his purpose. All the final thoughts as the years passed. Blade's story became one of legend in the small town. People would come to the bakery, not just for the food, but for the man behind the counter. The man who had proven that peace was the hardest victory to achieve, and that a simple life could be the most rewarding. And as Blade looked around at the life he had built, he knew that the biker encounter had been more than just a physical fight. It had been a test of who he was, a trial that showed him the importance of control, resilience, and choosing peace. No matter where his life had taken him before, it was the life he had now that mattered most. The bakery flourished. Blade's reputation as a skilled baker spread, and while the memories of his past never fully faded, they no longer controlled him. He had created a legacy not built on force or fear, but on community, resilience, and the sweet taste of a fresh loaf of bread. And in that bakery, Blade had finally found what he had been searching for all along: peace.